Hi, my name is Joe Albanese, and I have put together this video because recent community meetings and posts to the forum show that there is a lot of interest regarding our reserve fund, the reserve study, and the financial health of our community. Unfortunately, there is a lot of misinformation being spread, and since we have a budget meeting coming up shortly, I thought I'd try to provide you with some factual information that might be helpful prior to the meeting and to assist you in formulating questions that you might like answers to. I am not doing this video at the behest or approval of the board of directors or the finance or budget committees, and I'm solely responsible for its content. I will not try to persuade you to support any particular course of action, but rather to make sure everyone is working with the same set of facts. So let's jump right into it. As all of you know, a reserve fund is basically a savings account the association has set aside to defray the future repair, replacement, or additions to the major components which the association is obligated to maintain. Valencia House has two reserve accounts, one dedicated solely to the painting and roof cleaning of our homes. The other account is a pooled account for all other association components, and which will be the focus of this video. The 2022 budget allocated $245,000 for the painting reserve and $761,000 for the pooled reserve. And as of July 31st, we had $2,334,000 in our reserve accounts. So how much money do we need in these accounts, and how much do we need to contribute each year to be fiscally responsible? Well, that is the $64 million question, isn't it? And that is where a professionally prepared reserve study can help us answer those questions. A reserve study is a long-term capital budget planning tool which identifies the current status of the reserve fund and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset ongoing deterioration, resulting in sufficient funds when those anticipated major common area expenditures actually occur. The reserve study consists of three parts: the component analysis, financial analysis, and financial strategies. So which physical assets are funded by the reserves? Well, there's a four-part national test to determine which expenditures should be in the reserve component list. First, it must be a common area maintenance responsibility, so not something that the homeowners are responsible for. Second, the asset must have a limited life. Third, the remaining life must be predictable. Fourth, and it must meet a minimum threshold cost, usually a percentage of an association's total budget. But let's go back for a second to the second and third requirements for a moment. It must be a predictable expense. Unpredictable expenses such as damage due to fire, floods, hurricanes, or even roof trusses are expenses more appropriately handled from the operational budget, insured loss, or special assessment. If we want a contingency line, it needs to be in the operational budget, not the reserve fund. So now that we have determined what assets are included in the component list, an analysis needs to be made to estimate each of the assets' useful life, remaining useful life, and current repair or replacement costs. The company that Valencia House contracted to do our reserve study, Association Reserves, listed their criteria for determining an asset's useful life and remaining life. They are as follows: visual inspection, the Association Reserves database, client history, and vendor evaluation. And their criteria to determine the repair and replacement costs includes, in this order, actual client cost history or current proposals, comparison to the Association Reserves database of work done at similar associations, vendor recommendations, and national industry guidebooks. And maybe now is a good time to briefly talk about Association Reserves, the company that did our study. They were founded in 1986, so they are in their 36th year of business. And you can see they opened offices in Florida in 2011. And by 2020, they had completed over 60,000 reserve studies. Those 60,000 studies contribute to the Association Reserves database, which is used to help determine the useful life and replacement costs. So when I hear residents stating that they disagree with the estimates of the reserve study, I have to wonder what particular expertise those residents might have that make them confident that their estimates are somehow superior to that of a company that has been doing this for 36 years and has done over 60,000 studies. I think the board has a fiduciary obligation to give great weight to expert opinion as opposed to conjecture offered by residents. And if you look at the reserve study, which you can find on the Valencia's website, you will see that they have 130 pages providing information on our assets, detailed observations, photos, commentary on each component, with an explanation of how they arrived at the current cost estimate. For instance, in some components, Valencia's had already received proposals or estimates, and association reserves would use those numbers. And on other components, they may have relied on their cost database or on a client cost history. So when all those assets are assessed, we would now have the useful life, remaining useful life, and current replacement cost for each component. That data is then used to calculate the fully funded balance. Let me show you how that works. Let's take a look at one line in the reserve study, line 2165, mailboxes. Our original low-cost budget-type mailboxes were all replaced in 2014. And as you can see, the total cost to replace the mailboxes today would be $222,500. The mailboxes are estimated to have a 20-year useful life. And as you can see, the total cost to replace the mailboxes today would be about $222,000. The mailboxes are estimated to have a 20-year useful life. And if you divide the cost by 20 years, you come up at $11,125 per year if you were to spread out that cost equally over the life of the mailboxes. As the mailboxes are 9 years old, the remaining useful life is 11 years. So to be fully funded, we would need to set aside $100,125. 9 years times the $11,125. That is the accumulated deterioration value, or the fully funded balance of that component. For those that like formulas, it can be represented this way. And if we add this column for every component, we get our fully funded balance. In this report, that amount is approximately $4.1 million. And to calculate our percent funded, we divide the total amount that we have in the reserve account for pool of components by this fully funded balance number. Okay, and before we move on, I am sure many of you are asking yourselves, why are they using current costs when we know there will be inflation and these replacements will cost more in the future? It's an understandable observation. But that is the way a fully funded balance is calculated, by current cost. That is the way everyone does it. No one can say with any confidence what the inflation rate will be 15, 10, 5, or even 2 years from now. But we do know, or should be able to estimate, the current cost of replacement. One other point to note is that the reserve study should be done every year. Not a full reserve study like we had in March of this year, which was created from scratch, but an update. Association Reserves offers several levels of update services. They have an update that doesn't require a site visit, where component information is updated based on information provided by us about what repairs and replacements have been completed since the prior study, and what components might need to be added to the list, and to examine the current costs to repair and replace those components and make the necessary adjustments. For example, let's go back to our mailbox. If they determine during the update that the cost to replace the mailboxes increased due to inflation to $230,000 from the original $222,000, then all the numbers get recalculated. That will result in the updated fully funded balance for this component to be slightly higher in 2024 than it was in the prior study. All components get recalculated in this way based on updated information, and we can then recalculate our reserve fund strength and reassess our funding plan. There's also a reserve study update that does involve a site visit and should be done every 3 to 5 years. This is where all components are visually examined to document any changes. but it is still less time intensive and less expensive than a full study because the counts have already been conducted and measurements have been taken. Again, our reserve fund strength will be recalculated and our funding plan reassessed. So as you can see, a reserve fund study is not something you do one time and forget about it for 5 years. It is something that needs to be updated annually so the best and most current information is available in order to make financial decisions. Now remember, we're still in the financial analysis stage where all we're trying to do is determine the health of our reserves and get a handle on exactly where we stand. When we move into the next stage, financial strategies, we will be factoring in inflation, interest rates, and additional components that we might want to add. And we'll talk about that a little later in the video when we discuss the plan the Financial Committee is recommending to fund the reserve account. So let's look once again at the findings of the reserve study that we had done in March. They calculated that as of January 1, 2023, our fully funded reserve balance would be $4,088,000, and that our projected starting revenue balance will be $1,007,000. And if you do the math, that comes to 24.6% funded. Again, that was based on projected numbers from early in the year. But now we have more data and actual numbers to work with, which allow the Finance Committee to update the projected percent funded strength to 28.2%, which still puts us in the high risk of special assessment category, but a bit closer to medium risk. As you can see, the percent funded determines whether the association is classified as having a high, medium, or low risk of special assessments to meet future reserve expenses. 0 to 30% funded, high risk. 30 to 70%, medium risk, and above 70% is categorized as low risk. Based on the data of 30,000 reserve studies in the Reserve Associates database, 30% of associations fall into the low category, 40% in the medium category, and 30% in the high category. Okay, so now that the financial analysis of the reserve study is completed, and we have a good idea of the health of our reserve account and what the landscape for future expenses looks like, we are ready to move into the financial strategy stage to put together a plan to provide appropriate levels of funding for our reserve account. There are basically 3 strategies when it comes to funding the reserve account. One is the baseline strategy, where the objective is to simply keep the reserve cash balance above 0. Anticipated reserve expenses for each year are added up, and they can be charted as you see here. You can then calculate the ending reserve fund balance by adding the starting balance, contribution, and interest, and then subtracting the expenses. A chart can then be produced showing the ending fund balance for each year. Here's a chart from 2015 utilizing this method. As you can see, the fund balance always had a buffer of about $1 million in the account. And that basically describes the second type of funding strategy, threshold funding, which is to use the baseline method, but to always have a buffer, a predetermined cash amount in the fund after expenses. And finally, the most conservative funding strategy is to use the fully funded method, where the goal is to have funds in the account equal to the value of deterioration of assets, or as we described before, the fully funded balance. Now remember, all of these strategies use the same underlying data from the financial analysis, but use different methods to compute contribution amounts. Association Reserves in their report recommends the fully funded method and provided 2 funding options, one optimal and one minimum alternative. The optimal and recommended funding plan calls for a contribution of $916,000 in 2023 and every year thereafter, while the minimum contribution requires $730,000 per year, which is a little less than the $761,000 we contributed in 2022. So let's take a look at a table to show what the recommended contribution would do to our percent funded over the years. A reminder, these tables are using the estimated numbers from the beginning of the year, which we have since updated, but let's stick with this for demonstration purposes. So as you can see, the table shows a contribution of $916,000 every year. But our anticipated reserve expenses vary a great deal year after year. For example, in 2025, we only anticipate $181,000 in expenses, but the very next year that jumps to $2.1 million. That is why looking at the balance in our reserve fund is a meaningless metric. It is the percent funded that truly shows the relative health of our fund. Now, our percent funded won't change very much after the first year because we have relatively high expenses in 2023. $913,000 in expenses and $916,000 in contributions, pretty much a wash. So we won't see much improvement. But the next year we only have $118,000 in expenses, but we still have a contribution of the $916,000. And as you can see, that moves us into the yellow or medium risk category with a 40.6% funded. And with consistent contributions of $916,000, we could see ourselves in the green or low risk category by 2032. And it continues to improve from there. The table for the minimum contribution works the same way, but as you can see, with the smaller contribution of only $730,000, we stay in the red zone for more years and never get into the green zone. Here's another way to look at it. This charts the percent funded for each year under the recommended funding plan, the green line, the minimum plan, the gold line, and if we use the prior budget's contribution amount of $761,000. Now, these tables do not include interest, and the inflation rate was only calculated at 1%, but it's a starting point. But what's really neat is the Association Reserves has software that they call UPlanIt, Measure the Past, Model the Future, that allows an association like ours to enter our own variables, such as the rate of inflation and contribution amount. It also allows us to enter new components into the component list for future anticipated projects, something like mosaic virus, for example. The software then utilizes all the data gathered in the financial analysis, combines it with the new variables, and produces a table like the ones we've been looking at. And that is exactly what the Finance Committee did to come up with the funding plan that they will be recommending to the board for our 2023 budget. So let's take some time and look at their plan. Oh, and by the way, this is not final and can change, but it was what was presented at the town hall meeting. First thing I want to bring to your attention is the interest and inflation assumptions. As you can see, this table incorporates a 1% interest rate and an inflation rate of 3%. I believe that 3% is for the first 15 years and it zeroes out for the remaining years. The next thing you might notice is that the expenses have changed here because the Finance Committee added additional components with a cost of $244,000, and they have added $500,000 in 2024 and 2025 for mitigation of the mosaic virus problem, whatever that may be. So the Finance Committee added a total of $1.25 million to the anticipated expenses to make the reserve fund percentages as realistic as possible. The next thing to look at is the schedule of annual contributions. As you can see, for 2023, they will be recommending a contribution of $960,000 and $978,000 the following year, with modest increases thereafter until 2037. So now that we have inputted an interest rate, an inflation rate, added some additional expenses, and laid out a contribution schedule, we want to see what that does to our percent funded. Remember, the percent funded is the true thermometer measuring the health of our reserve fund, not the starting balance. So as you can see, we slowly increased the percent funded and reached the yellow medium risk in 2025, but then dropped back down into the red in 2027. You might ask why. Well, because we have high anticipated expenses like the paving of our roadways. So we take a hit for that year to our reserve fund, but immediately the contributions start building up our reserve balance and our percent funded numbers. And as you can see, we reach the green in 2033. So that's the game plan. I'm sure many will be skeptical as to the accuracy of a table like this a few years down the line. I understand that. And that is one of the reasons why the study has to be updated every year, and all of those numbers get recalculated. But if we use the best data available regarding our components, make good faith economic assumptions, and update our study every year, we should be able to maintain a healthy reserve fund and not be caught short. I'm sure that at the budget presentation, more details will be provided by the Finance Committee regarding this funding plan. But I wanted to give you this basic information prior to the meeting so it all makes more sense to you. Well, I hope this video has helped you understand the financial situation of Valencia Isles a little bit better than you may have before. We as a community have some important financial decisions to make over the next several months. So I hope everyone attends the budget meeting that's going to be on October 18th, and we'll go from there. Thank you for your attention.